Happy Monday, everyone. Whether you love it or hate it, chances are we're getting another Spider-Man game from Insomniac, after the second game reportedly made a, boatload of money. So with that in mind, I want to make some suggestions for what I want to see, or in some cases, don't want to see, in the next Spider-Man game. Also, just to clarify, I'm assuming the next game would be Spider-Man 3, but if the next game is another spin-off like Marvel's Spider-Man SilkSong or whatever, then these would apply there too. So let's talk about the things that I think would improve Spider-Man 3. Let's get the controversial one out of the way, which is to have better human segments. Notice, I didn't say less human segments. And I say that because I believe they can be done right, but there has to be some specific options for players. First, these human segments should be somewhat optional, and should serve a purpose outside of simply showcasing the world from the human side of view. If I want to see the world from someone who doesn't have superpowers, I can go outside, bro. I don't need a bike ride in the game to tell me that. People complained about playing as MJ and Miles in the first game, but they didn't complain about the moments where you play as Peter in Otto's lab. Coincidence? Hell no. The reason it worked there is that it serves both Peter and Otto's arc, and those scenes could largely be skipped. We had a cutscene that showcased the important info, and then any extra stuff was left to the player's discretion. I understand why we want to include this stuff and encourage players to engage with it, but it's important to remember the audience. Many people want Spider-Man first, and sure, they might be convinced to like the human stuff, but considerable care needs to be given to how often these under-the-mask moments happen, the purpose they serve, and the player's agency within them. This extends past the usual criticism of these segments being boring to play. It's about pacing. When we put 45 minutes of biking and walking through the high school in the beginning of Spider-Man 2, we're exhausting the players early. In Miles Morales, the human segments are much less egregious because it happens during Christmas dinner, just after an explosive opening, and it happens once again at the science fair, just before the end of the game. In both instances, they are shown as a calm before the storm, and serve the purpose of hitting the brakes for a moment after a roller coaster ride. In Spider-Man 2, we slow down by doing side quests, taking pictures, and then the game pumps the brakes even more with the biking segment. I don't mean to harp on this scene too much, but I want to really exemplify that I think there are ways to do these segments right, and even if it is difficult, it is possible. I think cutting them back in certain instances would be a good idea too. If we again look at Spider-Man 2, then I'd say the final Mary Jane segment was absolutely unneeded and sours many of my replays, which leads me into my next point. I want shorter missions for the sake of replayability. Since the release of Miles Morales, replaying missions has become something of a standard within the franchise, and I can't imagine it doesn't return in Spider-Man 3. However, I want these missions to be shorter. I don't want set pieces per se to be shorter, but if there are two forms of gameplay in completely different spheres, don't bundle them together. For example, sometimes I want to replay the final boss fight against Venom as Miles, but in order to do that, I need to trudge through the Mary Jane segment that starts the final mission, and then go through the first phase of the fight as Peter. That's a massive pain in the ass, and a similar sentiment is shared for missions like The Flames Have Been Lit. One of the coolest scenes in the game is when Peter arrives at the chapel, but to get there, the scene where it's a black-clad thunderstorm, I need to start at sunset, hunting down the bonfires, then move through the segment inside Craven's mansion, and after that, can I get to the scene in the chapel. These two instances are my favorite parts of the game, and yet, the one I replay the most is the opening mission. Why? Because it's the only one where I can get straight into the action. If we want to maintain the current style, that's fine. But then I suggest another remedy, which is to include encounter selection. This is something I first saw in Uncharted 4. When you go to replay a chapter, you can specifically replay any encounter within that chapter. For a game as cinematic as Uncharted 4, this was a godsend for when I just wanted gameplay. It must be a hard thing to code in because I'm shocked at how few games generally feature something like this. Next up on the wishlist is better swinging. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the swinging is good in this game, but I still think there is room for improvement. And we can look at some of the other Spider-Man games to see where. When it comes to the cinematic swinging, Spider-Man 2 has everyone else beat, but I think the realism provided in the older Spider-Man 2 could be a point of inspiration. I know they added the swing assist toggle, and that's great and everything, but that doesn't result in a massive gameplay difference, and it doesn't satisfy the player's desire for a physics-based system. I want to have more control in the sense that I want to do a loop-de-loop more than once. I want the ability to slam into a wall and have it actually ruin my momentum, and I want the ability to look bad at the game. I think doing something like this would introduce a whole new world of swinging depth, but the problem is the average player doesn't want it. A truly physics-based system would introduce a world of challenge for the average player, and while for people who want that challenge it might be good, I can't act like our needs are more important, so I propose a split system, like the old Spider-Man 2. We can have regular swinging and then an advanced mode that features the physics-based swinging people sometimes want. This way both sides of the fanbase are satisfied, and we aren't alienating people that still want some training wheels. Since we're on the topic, we gotta shut the fuck up about people using the max swing assist. My god, who gives a shit if someone wants an easier experience? Let them have fun. And another thing I'd like to see with swinging is some new actions like web climbing and better wall crawling. Currently, wall crawling doesn't get a lot of love, but it's a fundamental part of Spider-Man's moveset, so we can't so quickly ignore it. I'd also love the ability to swing with two webs, especially in a physics-based context. This maneuver would allow players to restabilize themselves in the middle of the street, on the fly. Ultimately, a lot of this boils down to wanting more control, and control in a movement system like swinging, one where expression is at the forefront, can only result in a better system. The more players can do, the more they can express themselves, and I love that in Spider-Man 2, you can see the difference between two people based entirely on how they swing. What techniques do they use? When are they using them? I personally never use air boosts, meanwhile I see people online that use them as the main means of traversal, practically flying across the map with them, and I think that's really cool to see. So this next one might be a bit controversial, but I think it's completely necessary, and that is some kind of power reset. I think there's a problem with the second game, or more accurately, the seeds of a problem, that if not put in check by Spider-Man 3, will have the game jumping the shark from the get-go. Peter and Miles in the second game are simply too powerful. I know there's the issue of Peter being nerfed, but I don't mean in that sense, because power set wise, Peter is not so strong. By the end of the game, Peter has the anti-venom suit, which is basically the black suit without any downsides, and Miles has an upgraded form of his venom powers. And that's by the end of the game. Even in the beginning of the game, Miles is flying across the map like a Super Saiyan, and in the final fight with Venom, Peter is literally growing kaiju hands to grab onto him. If we start the third game at this level of power, we're not going to be looking great, because any threat to a power like this would need to be on the scale of the world, or even the multiverse, God forbid. Spider-Man's best stories are often small scale. I think you can still have ambitious villains who pose a threat. The first game had the Sinister Six, but we can't pretend that anything short of an Avengers level threat is going to stand in the way of even one of these guys. Also, I think if we cut down their power a little bit, we can find easier excuses to challenge them. Half the reason the fridge scene is so hated is because in the same game, Peter is able to pull off crazy feats of strength, and so his incompetence in this scene is even more jarring. And a similar sentiment is shared when Peter is barely holding onto a roller coaster. I think the game should start with a crazy large battle and end in the two Spider-Men getting beaten so badly that they lose some of their strength. In Miles' case, he can be physically weaker, and in Peter's case, he can lose the anti-venom suit. How they do this, I don't know, but I think it would improve the game significantly, and it can be done right without feeling like the player is nerfed for no reason. I think Infamous 2 does a great job of this, because even though Cole's power in those games is weakened at first, it opens the path to giving him new upgrades, and he can still, by the end of the game, be more powerful than when he started. With this, we can open more interesting narrative doors, where Peter needs to rely on his intellect and willpower to overcome challenges, instead of having a cum suit do the job for him. Okay, this is going to be a weird one, but this video is sponsored by some very important dishwasher tips. If you live alone, you probably don't know that your dishwasher has a filter. Take a look. Right here is where mine is. And what you can normally do is you can just twist it, and you can clean it. Mine is clean because I clean it very regularly, but you can see there's some chia seeds in there and other gross stuff. And a lot of people don't know about this, and they don't know that you're supposed to clean it. Some dishwashers, they have a cleaning tool, they have a cleaning thing already in there. But yeah, the other important thing is that before you start your dishwasher, you should run the hot water, because your dishwasher is actually hooked up to the same line as your sink. And so when it does that first rinse, it's gonna do it with cold water unless you heat it up beforehand. Something like, okay, yeah, that's hot. And so if you're gonna run your dishwasher, you get the water hot through here, and then you make sure that the very first load that you do has hot water in it, and it's gonna clean your dishes much better. So there's some stuff you probably didn't know and probably didn't expect to learn here. keep taking care of yourselves and taking care of your homes, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. This next point ties into the power scaling, and that is having a smaller scope. Now, I saved this one for last because I think it's the most unrealistic want, because, simply put, a business would never go for this, and Insomniac, and especially Sony, are businesses. There's always going to be a desire for the next game to be bigger and better, because what? Are we supposed to make trailers saying, guys, this won't be as crazy as the last one, but trust me, it's just as good? No, but I think a smaller scope would work in Insomniac's favor. I think a lot of the issues with Spider-Man 2 can be boiled down to biting off more than they could chew. Insomniac was a relatively smaller studio before Spider-Man, and by the time Spider-Man 2 came around, they had grown much larger, and I think those growing pains are visible in the final product. We see a lot of people talking about how rushed the third act was, and it's my belief that this was a product of the game simply being too ambitious. Trying to cram Kraven, Peter, Miles, Venom, and the Black Suit into one game when their track record for length is around 6 to 10 hours? There's no way that was ever going to work without the game taking ages to release. While I'd be fine waiting that long, the shareholders wouldn't. And so I think the next game would benefit from a smaller scope. You know, Brian Intihar has said many times that he enjoys telling the stories of not just Spider-Man, but of Peter Parker, and a smaller scope might enable that more. If the villainous threat is scaled back from being the end of the world to being the end of Peter's world, we could have more room for those personal moments that honestly separate Spider-Man from every other hero. The best moments from Spider-Man 1 were those when Peter is dealing with the people closest to him. That Aunt May scene was a world-ending threat, despite its small scale, because it was Peter's world. That person was practically his mother, and his inspiration for becoming Spider-Man was because his pseudo-father was killed, and he vowed to do whatever he could to not let it happen again. From the outside looking in, it's just an old lady, but to Peter and the player, it was the fate of the world. The reason Otto's descent into villainy was so well done is because, again, it was just a mad scientist shtick, but thematically, it was so much more. Otto was Peter's future. He's the person he wishes he could be, and the person he feels Spider-Man constantly shackles him from becoming. Otto's downfall is Peter's future shattering before his very eyes. I know the second game had Peter losing his friend, but it didn't represent something more, especially when, as far as the player was concerned, Harry was already lost. The most you could say is that Harry is what happens if Peter lets his anger consume him, but you could argue, 1, that this was already hammered home by the admittedly short Black Suit arc, and 2, you could argue that this was the same theme that Finn served in Miles Morales. This is why I think a smaller scope, one that's more tightly knit, could benefit the series greatly. People always compare Spider-Man to Batman Arkham, and you know why Batman Arkham is so beloved, despite all the games being relatively short? Because they are dense. So those were some of my ideas for how I would improve Spider-Man 2 in a potential Spider-Man 3. I know that some of these were a bit more abstract, but I wanted to offer something deeper than make the combat better, have better set pieces, or even things like bring back character bios and make it co-op, because yeah, that would be great, but some of those suggestions, specifically co-op, just aren't that feasible. I can't even begin to imagine the development cost it would take to get Spider-Man 2 fully functioning in co-op, let alone a third game. I want to focus less on saying do more and focus more on do different. I think Spider-Man 2, for as much as everyone likes hating on it, had the potential to be so much better than it was. Hell, I think that's why it was so lambasted, because Insomniac kicked so much ass with Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales, so we knew they were capable of more. If they learn the right lessons from Spider-Man 2, then Spider-Man 3 could be a true masterpiece, assuming Sony doesn't get in the way too much. So now I'm curious, what do you think should be in Spider-Man 3? Do you think there's a realistic way for them to walk back some of the poor decisions in the second game? And do you think they need to at all? Let me know, and I want to say thank you so much everyone for watching, and I hope you all have an excellent rest of your day.